I'm Evan Smith, the CEO of the Texas Tribune. On behalf of my colleagues at the Trib, I want to welcome you to this year's Texas Tribune Festival. Every one of our 11 years in business, the work of our nonprofit newsroom has been critically important, but never more than in 2020. We produce reliable, credible reporting on issues that affect everyday Texans, making them better informed and motivating them to participate civically. You and people like you, readers, donors, attendees at our events, make our public service journalism possible. If you value what we do, now is a great time to support us. Every dollar you contribute, up to $20,000 by September 30th, will be matched by the Lowy Law Firm in Austin. And they'll give another $20,000 to the Central Texas Food Bank. Learn more and give today at texastribune.org/give.
Thanks so much for joining us. I'm David Drucker with the Washington Examiner, and we're here for another edition of the Texas Tribune's virtual festival this year for obvious reasons. And I wanted to start on that note with Congressman Mike McCaul. He is the top Republican on the House Foreign Affairs Committee, or is it Foreign Relations Committee? I always get the House and Senate confused there, sir.
It's affairs, but there's an old joke about the Senate and the House on that, but I won't say that on this program.
We'll leave that for the folks at home. I wanted to begin, and we're also joined by Congressman Van Taylor, both Texas Republicans. Congressman McCaul, whose district is anchored in the Austin area, Mr. Taylor in suburban Dallas, Plano, Texas, to be exact. Both areas I know pretty well. I wanted to start by talking a little bit further from home, though, Mr. McCaul, and ask you about the coronavirus and things that you might have learned over the past several months in looking into how this scourge started, where it came from, who's responsible, and if you have a sense of what China could have done better to deal with this, to make it a lot easier on the rest of the world, not just the United States, but also things that the United States might have learned so that the next time we're faced with something like this, we could handle it better.
Yeah, thanks, David, and thanks to the Tribune Fest for having me. We just released our Origins of COVID-19 report, a very thorough investigation we performed on the Chinese Communist Party. What we found was quite disturbing, that at very early stages, when the virus was being reported by the doctors, they were immediately intercepted on WeChat. Many were detained and silenced when they were talking about a SARS-like virus. This would normally trigger a reporting requirement to the WHO in 24 hours, and yet it went for months. Then you had the authorities, the Chinese government, going into the laboratories, destroying some of the lab samples to take control over the investigation. And then finally, David, the human-to-human transmission piece was most egregious because Taiwan was warning about this, even though they had been kicked out of the WHO as an observer. The Wuhan WHO-owned expert was reporting it was human-to-human, and yet Director General Tedros decided to ignore that and side with President Xi. What happened after that was with the New Year festival, 5 million people leaving the city of Wuhan, going domestically throughout China, and then internationally. That is a point when it moved from an epidemic to a global pandemic. A lot of university studies show that we could have contained it up to 95%. And I think it's a big lesson learned that governments need to be more transparent. And we need a WHO that is not a crony to one government over another, but is going to report the truth. Because had the truth been reported, we just maybe could have stopped this from happening.
Congressman Van Taylor, I want to pick up on Mr. McCaul's point. The World Health Organization clearly could have done some things better. It at least could have been more of an honest broker. At least the president thinks so, and many Republicans believe so. But in addition to that, I wanted to get your comments on what the federal government, the United States government, should do differently in the future, understanding that not every country in the world particularly if it's China, is going to be transparent. They function differently. They have different goals than us, and they're not always going to be in a hurry to help us, in particular, the United States. And international organizations are not always aligned with U.S. interests, no matter how much funding we provide them. So when understanding that there are countries that this may happen in again in the future that are not going to be like an ally of ours that would alert us, and that not every international organization does what it should, at least from the perspective of many here, what does the U.S. government need to prepare for so that we can respond even in cases where it's challenging to do so?
First, thank you for having me. Great to be on the Trib Fest. Great to be back with everybody here, and I'm glad to see the show continues. First, I want to praise Chairman McCaul for what he has done in leading the China Task Force, and I just want to point out that the Chinese Communist Party actually did an expose specifically on what they called the McCaul report. It was actually a report of a committee that he was leading, but they went after him personally for exposing the Chinese Communist Party for what they have done in really at the very best bungling, and at the worst intentionally inflicting what is the worst pandemic in 100 years on the world. And so I really want to say he is at the tip of the spear, and he is taking the brunt of the blows from the Chinese Communist Party. There are a lot of lessons learned, I think, here, and I think that certainly there are, and I've been working on a bipartisan basis. As part of the Pandemic Preparedness Caucus, introduced legislation to look on a bipartisan basis to look at our strategic stockpile. We need to look at better testing strategies, sentinel testing strategies, trying to find diseases before they become to this level. And I think the other thing we need to do, and I think that Chairman McCaul can speak a lot to this, is changing our supply lines. I think it became apparent through this pandemic that the United States, in and of itself, did not have everything it needed to actually handle this. And so we had to go to extreme lengths to manufacture the PPE, to manufacture pharmaceuticals, to manufacture ventilators. I think the organic capability is here, but we weren't designed to do that from the start. And I think that making the United States more self-reliant to handle this kind of pandemic, I think, is something that we're going to do in the future. And I look forward to working on a bipartisan basis to do that.
I want to shift gears and talk about the economy. Before we went to air, there was another round of unemployment benefit requests that hit 870,000 Americans. So not as bad as the initial stages of the pandemic, but not necessarily stellar either. I wanted to, starting with you, Mr. McCaul, get your assessment of where we are in this economic recovery. How far do we have to go? And is it acceptable, or is it, given your view of the economy, is it acceptable that Congress may not pass another round of COVID relief? Both parties worked swiftly with the president early in the pandemic to pass a couple rounds of relief, some very substantial. The disagreements since the summer have continued. Does the economy need another shot in the arm, or are we making enough headway that, however unfortunate, it's okay?
I think, obviously right before an election, it gets very political, but I don't think we should hold the American people hostage because we have an election coming up. I think we have a responsibility to get something done like we did before in a very bipartisan way. The Paycheck Protection Program, perhaps one of the most successful government run programs on a massive scale in a very short period of time. So I think it's incumbent upon us to return next week to pass additional COVID relief package that would also include the Paycheck Protection program. And the latest, you hear things on the Hill. I am hearing indicators that in fact may be the case, that we most likely will be voting on a package this next week. I certainly hope so. And I hope it's bipartisan so that we know if it's passed, the Senate will pass it, and then it'll get signed into law by the president. The American people need this, and we need to be there for them.
Congressman Taylor, do both sides in this and the White House need to be a little more flexible? I know the president moved off of his initial resistance looks like House Democrats may be moving down from $3 trillion to $2.4 trillion. I'm not looking to cast the blame here. I'm just saying, is this thing that important that you'd like to see a repeat of what happened earlier this year, which was everybody sort of gave and got a little bit, even though there were plenty they didn't like about the final package?
Sure. I think there absolutely is a deal to be had here. And in July, when it was apparent that that August recess was going to begin and we were not going to have something put together. And again, I was kind of shocked that we were sent away. Always good to be home in Texas, but just kind of shocked that, hey, we've got work to do. This is important stuff. The country's hurting. My district is hurting. I mean, just talking to the single working mom that lost her job and is trying to find toilet paper, or the mom who is about to be evicted and her child just tested positive for COVID. These are heartbreaking stories of real pain that people are suffering in my district, and it's a very successful, affluent district, but there's still there's real need in my district. And I sat down and on a bipartisan basis as a member of Problem Solvers, we had meetings almost every other day for about a month. And we came up with a framework of a deal, and the number we came to was $1.5 trillion. And it actually had, if things got worse, the number would go up about $0.5 trillion. If it got better, it'd actually go down a couple $100 billion. That's kind of how we address this. But we showed on a bipartisan basis, there's 25 Republicans and 25 Democrats, that there was a deal to be had, that there could be a meeting of the minds. And also, let me point out, that means the votes are there. The votes exist on the U.S. House of Representatives to pass a deal that would then, in turn, help the American people at this incredibly difficult time. And I think you've just got to be completely tone deaf to your district and just not listening to the people if you're not concerned about this and don't want something to happen.
Let's talk a little bit about some foreign policy and some developments that the United States has helped negotiate overseas. We've seen the Trump administration orchestrate some countries in the Middle East recognizing Israel's right to exist as a Jewish state and establishing diplomatic relations with them. It's a little bit of a different strategy. Instead of focusing completely on the Israeli-Palestinian disagreement, go around that and find agreement where you can. How significant, starting with you, Mr. McCaul, do you think this development has been?
I think it's a game changer, a tremendous breakthrough. And I credit Jared Kushner primarily as the orchestrator of this. I saw an old clip of John Kerry saying there's no way that Israel could join with the Gulf Arab states if the Palestinian issue wasn't taken care of. And I think that theory proved to be not correct. I mean, why is this such a big deal? It's the first peace negotiation in 25 years. We had Anwar Sadat in Egypt and then Jordan 25 years ago. But also, these are the Gulf states, the Arab Gulf states, and I believe that more are going to join on. And the fact that Bahrain joined into this agreement, the Abraham Accords, and I was there at the White House, a very historic moment. But the fact that Bahrain had the green light to go forward means that Saudi is actually supportive. If the Saudis ever did get into this alliance, it would be hugely significant because the Palestinians will become more and more isolated on their own, with Iran as their only ally left. I talked to the ambassador from Qatar. He views their role as kind of the mediator, the negotiator with the Palestinians. And when I talked to the UAE foreign minister and Bahrain, they said, we don't want to wait any longer. We want to move forward with a peace plan in the Middle East with Israel, economically tied together, their technologies. We're tired of the Palestinians saying no to every deal and fundamentally just not recognizing the right of Israel to exist as a sovereign nation. And so this is a big step and movement forward. And I there will be other countries that will be announcing, I think, in the next few days. So it gives me great hope at a time when we have a lot of trouble, a lot of hard times right now.
Congressman Taylor, every new administration that comes in, Democrat or Republican, one of the central foreign policy questions they're supposed to answer is, what's your plan for the Israeli-Palestinian conflict? Do you think that this changes the paradigm in that regard? In that, instead of new presidents, whoever and whenever they are, being asked how you plan to solve this, do you think it allows the U.S. to pursue a different course for at least integration and a more peaceful Middle East, if not completely peaceful, and put the pressure on Palestinians to come to the table if and when they choose? Or do you think that the conflict with Israel is still so untenable over the long term, given how close together all those neighbors are, that it's still something that presidents current and future need to focus on?
Okay, so I think what you're seeing is the Middle East realign from an anti-Israel to an anti-Iran world, and so because the Iranians keep interjecting in different places around the region, right? So they're currently conducting a proxy war in Syria by backing the Assad regime. They're arming the Palestinians in the West Bank. They're arming the Palestinians in Hezbollah in southern Lebanon. They're backing the Houthi rebels, which overthrew the government in Yemen, and they're conducting attacks against Saudi Arabia. Last year, you watched the Iranians conduct attacks on tankers, on Saudi oil facilities. So as the Iranians are upping their game and they're doing more and more aggressive, you're watching states say, you know what, that's a more serious threat than Iran. Than Israel is. Therefore, we're going to realign with Israel and the United States against Iran. So you're watching that realignment play out. It's very slow, but you are watching it. But the Iranians are doing this to themselves. They're the ones that are choosing to interject in nation after nation, foment war, conduct terror attacks. And then the United States is responding. We're not just sitting around. We're responding by building allies, right? So we're building an alliance, which is what the Abraham Accords are. And then we're also responding militarily. I mean, killing General Soleimani in Iraq last year is a military response, a kinetic response to what the Iranians are doing. But clearly they're the troublemaker. They're the hegemon. They're the ones that want to interject and create war in the entire region because they want to take over the whole region. And if you don't want to be taken over by the Iranians, the United States and Israel actually are your friends.
Congressman McCaul, I wanted to ask you in that vein about China, who has designs on supplanting the United States as the world's major superpower. Understanding that President Trump has forcefully challenged the Chinese on issues and matters of trade and their unfair business practices, it seems as though administrations sort of come and go without recognizing China's patience and intent to challenge the United States around the world. And I'm wondering if Americans are focused enough on where China is headed so that we don't wake up one day and say, what exactly happened? We know the Chinese continue to build up their military, although they don't do it quite like the United States with their Belt and Road program. They are paying a lot of other countries to welcome them and their businesses. And of course, they're very aggressive in staking claims to the Asia Pacific region, and that includes Taiwan. What more does the United States need to be doing in order to try and stem the rise of China to the point where it becomes a problem?
Well, our China Task Force report will be coming out October 1st, and we deal with all of these issues that you talked about. We are in a global military and economic competition with the Chinese Communist Party. And I think, if anything, David, that COVID woke up the American people to that fact. I think Van and I have known this for years. I knew it when I prosecuted the campaign finance cases where China was putting money in our presidential elections. But over the last several decades, we've tried to bring them into the family of nations. We've tried to turn them to be more capitalistic, more of a democracy. And, I talked to Secretary Baker the other day about this and how much they really tried to bring China along. And he said, it just didn't work. And I think people, as Van talked about, when they're hoarding the PPE, they nationalize companies, they held us hostage with medical supply. We also need to look at the technology supply, too. I have a Chips for America Act bill that will bring back manufacturing jobs to the United States for advanced semiconductor chips, which are so vital to our national security. Many of these companies in the Austin, area, and we need to look at the supply chain. We also need to look at how can we compete better with China in the Belt and Road Initiative. They go in with their debt trap diplomacy, and particularly in the African developing nations in Latin America, and they plant down their 5G Huawei. They basically get them in a debt trap. They bring in their own workers, exploit their natural resources, and then they take over ports like Djibouti and Sri Lanka, or down on the Panama Canal. So we have to compete with them, and we have done things in Congress like the Development Finance Corporation, the Exim Bank, these tools working with the private sector to better compete. I can tell you the administration is really focused on this like a laser. We also need to look at our military posture in the South China Sea and our relationship with Taiwan, as they were threatening Taiwan just like they moved into Hong Kong, violating that treaty, and as they move in and threaten nations in the South China Sea. And then finally, the theft of intellectual property. I just can't stress that enough. There's a reason why the Houston consulate was shut down. It's because that was a hub of espionage in the United States. They were literally in MD Anderson's biomedical research lab stealing all of their data, stealing data related to the vaccine, and the largest transfer of human wealth in human history through their theft of IP. And they've been doing this for years. But we're finally waking up to what they've been doing, and we're saying, no more. Enough's enough. We are going to take a position, and we're going to compete with China. And long term, I believe we win. But we have to wake up to the fact that they are our biggest economic global competitor now.
Congressman Taylor, I'm wondering if the United States needs to rethink its trade approach to Asian nations. Obviously, the Obama administration had negotiated the Trans-Pacific Partnership, which was going to bind about 11 Asian nations to the United States, with the exclusion of China. American voters, right and left, wanted nothing to do with that. It's one of the reasons why President Trump was elected, but it's also one of the reasons why Bernie Sanders had so much traction in that 2016 primary that year. And there's been no appetite from either party since to explore multilateral trade deals. But I'm wondering if the United States shot itself in the foot and lost an opportunity to exert its influence in Asia and push back on China because of our resistance to a multilateral deal like that. Well,
I'm not sure I completely agree with that. I mean, so last year we ratified, the USMCA or NAFTA 2.0, which was certainly a multilateral agreement with the United States, Mexico, and Canada. And clearly those are our two biggest trading partners. So I think that was clearly a win all the way around. Yeah, and part of the thing about, it goes back to your very, very early on in this conversation about, what does the United States need to do? Well, we need to build our alliances with our friends. And I think that's what USMCA did. That was a positive win for the American worker. It was something that, President Obama's administration had hoped to do. They talked about doing it, but they weren't able to actually get around to it. President Trump used some unique negotiating tactics. I think gave us some nervous moments there, but ultimately he was able to get it done, and he was able to do it on a bipartisan basis. He was able to get Republicans and Democrats to come together. There were some tweaks in there in the last few minutes, but hey, it got done, and it's unquestionably a win for Texas. Texas is the #1 exporting state in America in terms of technology, and USMCA is going to help us export more, grow more jobs, grow Texas. And I think, to your question about, trade agreements by this presidency, they've been successful recutting deals in Europe with the EU. I think I would submit that's multilateral, because the EU is more than just one country back there, but you could argue that's only bilateral. And then also with Japan. So I think that clearly this current administration really deserves a lot of credit for doing a great job of redoing a lot of trade deals that were very unfair. And I think they were right to be calling out China, and they really pushed hard. They've gotten some things done there. But I think we're going to have to take matters into our own hands as far as it goes with China, and really take it to the next level.
Okay, and finally, gentlemen, I wanted to address the election because there is an election coming up, and Texas, lo and behold, has become a little bit competitive. Just as we were talking today, there were a couple more polls that showed the race for president, a single-digit race, a low to mid-single digits, not mid to high single digits. And some of your Republican colleagues are facing some challenges that in past years these districts didn't face. Talk to me about the political atmosphere in Texas and how you feel about your own re-elections.
Well, yeah, I think Texas is still a conservative state. It's a Republican state. I think the president will carry it. I think we all take it seriously. I think the last election cycle was a bit of a wake-up call. Some of that, though, I'd have to say was top of the ticket and straight party ticket voting had a very awkward effect down ballot. But I know Van and I, we're not taking this for granted. I started the day after the election running again and got a good team on the ground and doing all the right stuff. I do think the Republican Party, we need to look at the fact that our demographics are changing in Texas. I remember when I first, got elected, Bush, 43 was president. I remember him as governor going around the state. It was acceptable to compromise and talk to Democrats. It was very much in his style to give speeches in Spanish and reach out to the Hispanic voters, which he got about 40% of that. I think we need to get back a little bit to what Bush 43 did when the state first went Republican, because if we don't get that fact, then it very likely could go back to the Democrat side.
Mr. Taylor?
Sure. Look, every day I'm out there hustling, in Collin County and get a great response. I mean, we're a very successful county. We've been through an incredibly difficult time. I think everybody in America had their cheese moved by COVID-19, and some at tragic levels. I mean, this has been a very real pandemic. But I still see a lot of optimism in my district. People are hopeful for the future. They are very concerned about this defund the police movement, about the far left of the Democrat Party wanting to release criminals onto the streets, about the ideas of raising taxes, even though we're in a really difficult economic position. I think that's a terrible move for our country. And so when you tell them, look, I'm for low taxes, I'm for safe streets. I'm part of the team that's helped take this county to where it is. I'm going to help try to take it to the next level. People are very responsive to that and say, hey, I'm for Van Taylor. Sign me up. I'm going to vote for you.
Congressman Van Taylor, Congressman Michael McCaul, thank you both very much for joining us here on the Texas Tribune's virtual festival.
Thanks, David.
Great to be with you.
I'm David Drucker with the Washington Examiner. Thank you very much.